I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. This week, Sarah Lyall, a writer-at-large for The Times and the thrillers columnist for the Book Review, speaks to Zadie Smith about The Fraud, her new novel set in and around 19th century London. But first, Alexandra Alter and Julia Jacobs join me to talk about the National Book Awards and the recent controversy over its former host, Drew Barrymore. Joining me now are Alexandra Alter, a reporter here at the Book Review. Hello, Alexandra.
Hi, Gilbert.
And Julia Jacobs, a reporter for the Culture Desk. Hello, Julia.
Hello.
So we're here to talk about the National Book Awards and the controversy that the National Book Foundation, which is the organization that runs the awards, recently found itself in when the person who was set to host this year's awards, Drew Barrymore, did a boo-boo. Julia, from the culture side, can you tell us why everyone was so mad at Drew Barrymore?
There were a lot of twists and turns in this story over the past week. We had Drew Barrymore come out and announce that her show would be coming back after several months of hiatus. And this was unexpected because Hollywood is on strike right now. You have the writers on strike, you have actors on strike, many of whom are Drew Barrymore's guests on her talk show. But September 18th was supposed to be the first day of new episodes for Drew's show. But a lot happened before then. So she received a lot of flack from people accusing her of being anti-labor by making this decision. She doubles down and says that she wanted to bring back her show, not just for the viewers, but for the employees, over 150 people who work on the show. And she did this in this very emotional Instagram video that she posted on a Friday. But by the end of the night on Friday, she had deleted it. And by Sunday, she had made an entire reversal and announced that the show would not be coming back. And it ended up being kind of a litmus test for daytime talk shows. You had a couple of other shows who were planning to also come back decide after Drew's reversal that they were no longer going to come back.
Alexandra, what in the world does this have to do with books?
So this actually hit the book world pretty swiftly. The National Book Foundation had invited Drew Barrymore to host the National Book Awards this year. And they often have celebrity hosts. It's something they do to generate interest in this celebration that they have every year for the honorees when they announce the winners. And Drew Barrymore also has written about her love of books in her memoir. She occasionally has authors on her talk show. And I think she seemed like a good kind of advocate for books this year. But of course, with the writers in Hollywood on strike and the National Book Awards being an evening to celebrate authors, some people in the literary world immediately started pointing out the kind of irony or inappropriateness of her as a host if she was not taking the side of the striking writers. And one of the people I think who generated a lot of the conversation was Colson Whitehead, who is, of course, a National Book Award winner, very funny guy on Twitter. And he pointed out that in a kind of ironic tweet that this was not the best look. And so by September 12th, the National Book Foundation actually announced that they had rescinded her invitation. And in a statement, they said that the National Book Awards is an evening dedicated to celebrating the power of literature and the incomparable contributions of writers to our culture. In light of the announcement that the Drew Barrymore show will resume production, the National Book Foundation has rescinded her invitation. And they got a lot of praise from the literary community after putting that statement out. But it does leave them in a bit of a bind. The awards are coming up in November, and they need to find either another host or perhaps they will respond to Drew Barrymore's latest decision, which maybe Julia can fill us in on more.
A big part of why Drew Barrymore was getting flack for this decision was because her show did employ 3 Writers Guild writers. This is an issue that is about writers. And by bringing her show back, she was doing it without those striking writers. Her show at CBS in New York City was picketed by those writers, was picketed by actors who were also on strike. So I think all of this kind of came to a head for authors who saw this as a move that was antithetical to the spirit of writers. And so when Drew made that decision to reverse and to pause her show while the writers are on strike. She got a lot of praise for that on social media. It was a reversal. So it's possible that the National Book Foundation looks at this and says this apology she made was enough and will invite her back. Part of the anger, I think, over Drew Barrymore deciding to revive her show is that in early May, she made the decision to drop out as host of another awards show, an MTV Movie and TV Awards show. And at that time, she said, I'm doing this in solidarity with striking writers. And I think a lot of the reaction was linked to that sense, perhaps, of hypocrisy, with her then making the decision to, circumvent her own writers.
Alexandra, the long lists for this year's National Book Awards were announced recently.
The long list is long. There's 50 books on it, but it's interesting.
And these are multiple categories.
There's 50 books in 5 categories: fiction, nonfiction, translated literature, which was added a few years ago, and then poetry and young people's literature. To me, the most surprising list this year was the fiction list, just because there were a lot of big name authors with books out this year, including Lauren Groff, who has been a finalist 3 times for the National Book Award, and elder statesmen in the literary scene like Paul Auster and Michael Cunningham have works coming out. But a lot of the books on the fiction list were by up-and-coming authors who were published in some cases by smaller presses, and they were really interesting. A couple that stood out to me included Blackouts by Justin Torres, who wrote We the Animals, which was his debut. It became a bestseller. It was really well reviewed. The book is not out yet, but now everyone's looking forward to it even more. Another exciting person to see on there was Nane Kwame Adjei-Brenya, whose short story collection, Friday Black, was a big hit. And he came out with a novel this year, Chain Gang All-Stars, which is in the same vein of kind of futuristic sci-fi social satire. And it's wonderful. So yeah, some really interesting choices this year, as well as on the translation list, which I think is always a great category because it just brings more attention to works from other countries that might not otherwise get that kind of spotlight, particularly for the National Book Awards, which it's supposed to be about American literature for the most part, but they found this way to highlight books in translation that are released here.
I think this is a dynamic that we saw in last year's long list for fiction. Certainly, I recall it was also 10 books, many of which were by first-time authors or authors early in career, swerving in that direction as opposed to focusing on the names that maybe we would have all expected. The novel that won the National Book Award last year was The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty, which was a debut novel. So it could be a sign that the National Book Awards is trying to use its spotlights to shine it on up-and-coming authors as opposed to just sort of reiterating the people that we expect to win all these awards.
Yeah, I think that's a nice kind of ripple effect of these awards. They really can, even today with the retail landscape changing the way it has, like the National Book Award or the Booker or the Pulitzer can really make an author's career and just catapult them into the public, capture the public's attention in a way that it's hard to these days for authors and publishers.
Julia Jacobs, thank you for coming on the Book Review Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Alexandra Alter, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
We'll be right back.
I'm Sarah Lyall with the New York Times. I'm here with Zadie Smith. Zadie is the author of many novels, short stories, essays, and literary criticism. We're here to talk about her 6th novel, The Fraud. It's on the surface a historical novel set in the 19th century, mostly in London, a little bit in Jamaica, with a host of real historical characters. It contains multitudes, and I'm going to ask you, Zadie, to describe it a bit for us. What is it about?
Well, my experience describing this book is that it usually takes up all the time I have in any conversation. But in short, it's about an aristocrat called Roger Tichborne who went missing as a young man. And as in the Martin Guare case, about 20 years later, another man who didn't resemble him in any way turned up claiming to be Sir Roger Tichborne. He was called the claimant by the British public, and his great witness and defender was a formerly enslaved man called Andrew Bogle from Jamaica, who swore this was the Sir Roger Tichborne he had worked for as a young man. And it started a court case that lasted almost 3 years in England.
So that's the center of the book, but it's also a book about literary London at the time. Right. Dickens is a character. There's a bunch of other novelists who are characters. So we see that trial through the eyes of one character, and I'm going to talk to you about her in a minute. But before we get more into the book, as I read it, it's clear you did a ton of research on this. There's excerpts from novels. There's excerpts from the court case. There's every character I looked up turned out to be a real character. How much research did you do, and why did this case strike you? Why did you want to write about it?
Research makes it sound really heavy. It was actually a joy to read about this period and to read books set in the period. But I knew it was a true story, and then I imagined fictionalizing it a lot more. But everything that I read was so completely insane that it didn't need any further fictionalization on my part. But the literary London part I came across by accident because I live in a neighborhood where this writer, William Ainsworth, had his life. And his housekeeper, Mrs. Touchet, who is basically the narrator of the book, I read about in letters between him and his friends. And I think the central question for me is something I think about myself. Like, how do people go about their everyday lives, their petty desires, their professional existence on top of massive injustice? Like, how do people live their private lives when this is going on underneath them? And that seemed to me a question for today, a question for then. It was something I wanted to answer for myself.
And in the book, it takes, for anyone who's going to read it, and I hope everyone does, it takes an incredible turn in the middle where we've been really following the story of Mrs. Touchet, and it's very interestingly written because it goes back and forth chronologically, where it takes us a while to settle into where we are and who she is, I think on purpose. And then all of a sudden, we're in Jamaica, and we're hearing the story of this former slave and what happened to him. And it's a story I hadn't heard in that way before. And as I lived in London for a long time, I was always struck then by when we talked about race in America versus race in the UK, Brits would always say, of course, it's different for us because we didn't have slavery. That's why race is such a big issue for you guys and not for us. But of course, Britain did have slavery. It was enriched from the plantations of enslaved peoples in the Caribbean. As a Brit growing up with a Jamaican mother and a white British father, how much did you know about that as a child, and how much of this was new to you?
It was the same for me. It's a double silence, not only in England, but also in Jamaica, which is even more interesting. There is no equivalent. It's changing now, but when I was a kid, there was no equivalent of what maybe you see in Berlin, for example, with the actual physical city remembers the Holocaust. There are signs in the street. There are things in the pavement. It's a part of the fabric of Berlin. There was nothing like that in Jamaica. It was a time of pure tourism, and it was as if Jamaica had no history. It was just there for your permanent enjoyment, mainly for the enjoyment of Americans. So I was very aware of the history of America and the history of American slavery, partly because of what I read. I was obsessed with Toni Morrison. I was interested in American culture as a child. Yeah, but Jamaican history, I've written about it before, but I don't think I was aware of the indigenous people of Jamaica who were the Taino Indians wiped out by the Spanish. I don't think I would have had any awareness of that till quite late. So it's a series of aporias and absences. But I think what interested me writing this book is that it's a double absence, because not only do you lose the history of British slavery, which is an incredible loss for everybody, but you also, which I began to think is more to the point actually, lose a history of radical opposition and activism in the face of it, which was also occurring. So it's very interesting to me in English schools that not only do they not speak of slavery, but they also don't speak about a series of radical working and middle-class movements in England that were active at this time. Like, it is a double silence, and it's to the advantage of a certain kind of British thinking that both those stories are absent.
There's a moment in the book where we're now in the middle of the American Civil War where you talk about, I think it's Manchester, who votes not to accept any cotton from the American South.
Absolutely.
And I didn't know about that either. Is this changing in the UK now? Are people talking about this more?
I think it is changing. The part that interested me was exactly those forms of cross-cultural solidarity. The people of Manchester who are refusing that import of cotton are very poor themselves. It's not an easy boycott from that point of view. And it wasn't true everywhere. Liverpool, which was making money hand over the fist, was extremely supportive of the Confederacy, for example. But that mixed history is useful because it also gives you hope in the present, that it is always possible that you can make these analogies across experience, across cultures, across countries that are like mass acts of solidarity. I think it's in the interest of power to not confront those stories.
You recently wrote an essay for The New Yorker about the historical novel. I mean, it's about a lot of things. And in it, you set yourself up for saying, I never wanted to write a historical novel, but here I have. And then you went further and said, but of course, you can make a historical novel radically modern by using it as a prism through which to look at all sorts of things. And certainly your account of this trial and what it did to the public, how it consumed people's attention, the hysteria around it, sounded very modern and American to me. Why did it seize people's imagination so much? I feel I want to ask you about the class element of it especially.
I think it's an example of irrational politics, and we've had that recently with Trump. Populism of the far right, and it confounded rational intellectual commentators. They found it almost impossible to deal with this mass expression of desire. In the Tichborne case, it's left-wing populism, actually. It's a completely different flavour of populism, but it still confounded Victorian left-wing intellectuals. They couldn't understand why a man who was obviously lying, supported by a formerly enslaved man who was obviously lying, had created this mass hysteria and support in the public, which produced an actual political movement, several pamphlets, all kinds of petitions. They gathered around him with the argument that you people never give a working class man a fair shake in the courts. That's your problem. Of course, the newspapers pointed out, if he's a working class man, he's not Sir Roger, so this doesn't make any sense. But that kind of logic doesn't apply here, I think. In a court system that had been so unjust for so long, this explosion of fury at it makes a certain amount of sense. It doesn't make rational sense in the logic of its argument, but it makes emotional sense. And it makes ethical sense. It was time for this court system to change. And so the Tichborne case becomes a kind of test case. Like, one of the things it revealed was that there was no proper theory of law. Basically, lawyers were just posh men who liked to talk. They didn't have any kind of collective law board. So a summing up, I couldn't believe it when I was reading it, would quite often take a month and a half.
Well, and you said it was the longest trial in British history. It took more than a year, and they had hundreds of witnesses who often barely said anything, as you're pointing out. They just talked and talked.
It literally made no sense. It built to nothing. But a similar case in England in the 90s, the McLibel case, which is the second longest case, which is two penniless activists fighting this enormous American conglomerate, McDonald's, has some parallels too, and also was hugely popular in England. People gathered around the court, people supported these two, they sent them food, they were superstars. And it was another case of this kind of small person fighting this enormous system. I think the English are always constitutionally attracted to that David and Goliath scenario.
But this one also, it was partly a hatred of the experts, the educated, you people on the jury who went to these fancy universities. You don't know anything about what we're thinking.
At one point, the judge called them fools and fanatics, and they, as a collectivity, took that as their mentor, and they had banners saying, "We the fools and fanatics." They took it as a thing that they were proud of. So, of course, you can hear the echoes, but they weren't. You really didn't have to. I didn't feel like I had to force them, because it was like a rerun. It was so extraordinary to be writing this book and then watching something so similar happen around me.
Mrs. Touché, who recurs throughout the novel and is really its moral center and grapples with so many things that I think you're grappling with in the book, is a fantastic character. And one of the things I loved about her is that she has quite a complicated romantic life. And actually a lot of characters in the book seem to, and I felt there was a wonderful generosity in the way you looked at all that. Tell me a little bit about her and what you were doing with her.
I mean, I've always been interested in the sex life of the English, to say the least. I think it first surfaces with Bloomsbury, where for the first time, the people involved in these complicated relationships have some kind of language for it. I'm reading Virginia Woolf's diaries right now, and she's beginning to find words for the homosexual relationships in front of her, the polyamorous marriages that she grew up around. She's beginning to think that this is a thing that has always been but has never been spoken of. So when you go back another 150 years, all the same things are happening. I guess that's my point. There's no advances in sexual life. I know people like to think there are, but everybody is always doing everything and always has been doing everything. All that changes is language for it, basically, and ways of speaking about it. When I was looking at these Victorians, the curiosity of their marriages, like some of the stories are famous. George Eliot's first actual real marriage after her long relationship with Lewis is with a young man who on their wedding night jumped out of a window to avoid her. So a lot of things were unspoken, right? A lot of these marriages, which we had names for later, like lavender marriages or whatever, have no language here. So people are just experiencing things without the protection of identities for them. And I found that really fascinating.
And then you had John Ruskin and the pubic hair.
Yeah, John Ruskin, the pubic hair is a famous one. He didn't realize there was pubic hair, and when he saw it, was completely horrified. So those stories, why we're so surprised by them, I think, is because all our experience is mediated. So we don't have any new experiences. Like even long before the internet, we have television to tell us who we are, what we feel, what we can expect to see, what sex is going to be like, what marriage will be. We know we're given this mediation before. So when you go back in time, what you're dealing with is people with less layers of mediation. And it just, to me, is fascinating. And I guess I don't take the view that a person less mediated is necessarily more miserable. I think often they can be. Like, people like to have terms for themselves. And also, if you want to be treated with decency in front of the law, you need a language. You need to say who you are and what your rights are. But I was wondering, just for myself, isn't it possible that there are also wild freedoms, sexual, personal, existential, which come with having no language at all for what you feel and what you do?
Well, certainly women were allowed to live together if they didn't really say why they were living together,
and that's the double edge of it. Queen Victoria did not believe that lesbianism was a thing, had no language for it. And those women were unlegislated. I think all the way through my work from the beginning, I've always been interested in it, like, is this language what frees us or what captures us in a new way? And I really don't have an answer. I'm just interested in it.
But also, it's so joyous because Mrs. Touchet has a wonderful sexual relationship with her cousin.
Yeah.
Even though he's a jerk and he's super self-absorbed, he's a terrible novelist. And she also has a great relationship with his wife. And she at one point muses, if he had been a little more open, maybe we could have all three been doing it together.
And that was all a guess, but reading his novels, or as much of them as I could read, there are quite often these completely, I think on his part, unconscious S&M scenes and sex scenes where characters are with two prostitutes and they seem to look like his wife and Mrs. Touchet. These days, we would immediately make the Freudian readings, but William's writing without any sense that he has a subconscious. He doesn't think he has a subconscious. He thinks he's writing adventurous stories. And when we read them, it's so visible to us that this is a man with all kinds of interesting desires. I think sometimes when we're reading those kind of people, we patronize them a little bit because we feel so sophisticated with our sense of the subconscious and our progressive ideals. But I'm always amazed by that unself-consciousness, the fact that he's writing without any awareness that he's preoccupied with S&M ideas. He doesn't know that, but I know that about him.
The other thing about Mrs. Touchet that's so lovely is we see her age in the novel, but we actually see it at different points. She starts as an old lady, she ends as an old lady, but we see her at different points in her life, and we grapple along with her with what it means to be an aging woman. And I wonder you're 47 now,
Yeah.
right? So you're right in the middle. And I feel like you can...
I love that New York optimism. I'm in the middle because I'm going to live to 104. Yeah.
The question is, when do you get to stop being middle-aged? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, how long
in New York, never. We know that. But in the rest of the world, I am already an old lady. And my experience of time is exactly that. I just walked from 10th up to here in the 50s, and I thought, sometimes when I'm walking down the street, I think I'm 26, and then I look in the mirror and I'm like, oh no, I'm not 26. Or you can skip lightly and really think you're 10 or 11. And then other days you wake up feeling the full weight of your life, and you feel every second old that you are. I guess I distrust narratives that flatten it out and tell you that people experience their lives in this very rational, chronological way, because I just really don't think they do. I think people are overwhelmed by their memories all the time. A certain smell can set you off, or someone in the street who looks like someone you knew 20 years ago. There's all this kind of mess with time in your mind as you move through your life. And that's been my experience, knowing exactly the age I am, but constantly being struck by memories of other times.
Also, as she ages, she muses about what it's like to be a woman who's more invisible. Everyone's talked about that a lot when you're a woman. But toward the end of the novel, a great thing happens to her. She starts to find she's always had an inside voice. There's all these wonderful scenes where she's with all these literary men and she's making really wry, fantastic observations, but always to herself. I mean, we read them, but then something happens at the end. She starts to pick up a pen, as it were, and start writing. And she finds a liberation in that, doesn't she?
Yeah, and there was a lot. It's funny sometimes reading people writing about the book because they sometimes imply that it's anachronistic or impossible to imagine a woman writing a novel. But of course, that Victorian period is literally chock-a-block of women, particularly women in their 50s and 60s once their children were gone, and particularly aristocratic women, writing endless novels. They're all out of print because a lot of them were bad, but like East Lyme and these books which sold millions, which Virginia Woolf, for example, was really interested in. She loved all those out-of-print Victorian ladies, but women wrote a lot. And they published a lot and they were really popular. So I think that's another version of the past that's been slightly flattened out, where we imagine women's literature is dotted with the few geniuses, Bronte, Austen, Eliot, and then it's a wasteland till A.S. Byatt. But it really isn't the case.
For many years when you lived in New York, you were teaching fiction at NYU. Right. And you said recently that your favorite novel to teach was The Bluest Eyes by Toni Morrison, which weirdly I just read last week for the first time. And I wondered why it's your favorite.
I think its narrative strategies are unbelievable. And it's really interesting teaching it now because I think people have an idea in their heads of that book. If you only read the description of it, you think it's like a first-person account of a girl who wants to be blue eyes and is agonized by her blackness. And that's the kind of back copy of the book. But the book itself is nothing like that. The book itself is a series of different voices and perspectives, including at one point there's a kind of 10-page section through the eyes of a paedophile. Like, people really forget what's in that book. It's extremely challenging and incredibly moving. And she sets herself this task, which is something I've admired my whole life, of describing the self-hatred of this little girl without ever for a moment succumbing to it in narrative, but without either saying editorially, she felt bad about herself, she shouldn't, racism is wrong. She doesn't do any of that. She just lays out this child's life through a series of different perspectives with an enormous amount of sympathy and interest, even in the people who victimize her. And this incredible picture of the kind of town Toni Morrison grew up in, which is not unlike my town in that it was extremely multicultural. That was the unusual thing about her childhood. And she's very attuned to that, to the Italians and the Jews and the blacks all living in this one place. And this is all done, by the way, in whatever it is, 120 pages. It's an extraordinarily condensed, brilliant work about America, about race, about little girls, about power, about broken families, but about not speaking of them as broken families, like knowing that there's something very wrong with this family, but not allowing the reader to feel superior to them. That's all the juggling acts that are going on in that book, and the precision of the language and its sheer beauty. She was just really the best there was.
And I feel like there's a generosity of spirit she has, and a sense of questioning and wanting to look at things from all sides that I think you have in your fiction too. And when I was reading that book, I was struck by how some of the most monstrous characters, when she allowed us to go back and see their backstory, it wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason maybe. No. And you had sympathy for them, even if they behave really badly.
The bit about Toni Morrison no one ever talks about is she was a really committed Catholic. And that has been completely lost in her posthumous reputation. She was a Catholic. And I think she came from a kind of the socialism and kind of radical version of Jesus that I find in those books comes from her Catholicism. And that, I think, is quite hard for younger readers because they have two boxes in their mind of people who like God and people who like literature. But Toni was both. And that kind of radical vision of radical Christian perspective is really interesting to me. And I think it's in those books, but it's very rarely spoken about by her critics, both for and against.
You're a prolific literary critic, and I wonder how that affects you as a novelist. Do you hear your own criticisms in your head? Do you apply them when you're writing a novel? Does it stop you ever?
No, there's like a picture of me as some kind of like neurotic girl, always trying to please. Like, I'm not a child, and there is a kind of sexism in literary criticism that even now we still assume that men write as they want and women are like at the mercy of the critical view. But I write exactly as I want. And the novels that I've written, their difference from each other is not because I need instruction. It's because I bore easily, to put it simply. And each book needs to be something different for me. I become interested in different things. I'm sure the book critic part of me is a strong part of me, but that's the editorial part of me. When I write a line, I don't leave it just because I wrote it. I think, well, is it any good? And then I try and sharpen it up. But I don't feel any kind of agonistes between the critic me and the novelist me. In fact, Tony said that thing, like she said, critic, teacher, writer, it's all one job. I work with words, and it is all one job.
I read this book as a book, and I started this morning listening to the audiobook, which you narrate yourself, and you do the voices, and you do singing, and you have an amazing Scottish accent. What was it like narrating it, and was it fun, hard to do all those voices and audio features?
I've never done it before, apart from the Embassy of Cambodia, which is very short. And the immediate problem when they asked me to do it was I can't do a Scottish accent. So then they hired a voice coach, God bless Penguin, who was a lovely lady called Helen Ashton, who was working on the Barbie movie at the time. So it was amazing to work with her. And she gave me like 6 classes, and we got something passable. But then the other problem was I have a double brace in that you can probably hear right now. It's behind my teeth, some German mechanics. So I'm more used to it now, but I had an enormous lisp. So I went into it full of this, oh my God, a bad Scottish accent and a lisp. But I loved doing it. I'm such a ham. And my brother is an actor, and previously I've made him do some of them. He did White Teeth, and he said, I will never do that again. It is that book is too long, and my life is too short. So it had to be me, and I was very agonized about time, because I always say no to audiobooks because it does take time, and I always want to be writing and not doing other things. But I really enjoyed it. I love doing all the voices, and I don't know, I hope it's a good listen.
I commend it to our listeners to immediately go and buy the audiobook as well as the regular book. And finally, you lived abroad for 17 years. You moved out of London, partly because you were so famous so young. And I think you said at the time, or have spoken since, about just it's hard to be a famous writer in England because you're such a big deal. You're never really anonymous. And then you moved back during the pandemic. Why? And what's it been like?
I moved back, like a lot of expats in New York. You spend your whole time every day talking about how you're going to move home. And then 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. But I didn't. I think some people leave New York with this triumphant sense of, I'm done with New York. And I never felt that. I felt like New York is the greatest city in the world. I'm sorry to say that to London. And that it had, at some level, defeated me. Like, you need a lot of energy to stay in the city. And I think I was just a bit tired. But I will regroup and return to the battle at some point. But being back in London is good. Like, I'm old now, and they're less interested. But it is a hard place to be a young writer, I think. Like, when Sally Rooney came up, I love Sally so much and I love her work. But I did have a bit of PTSD watching that go down. You know, I was like, I couldn't believe it was going to happen again. But Sally's not like me. Sally is nails, if she won't mind me saying that. So nothing bothers that girl. So she's not going anywhere. And she's an island anyway. But I saw that they still have that appetite for, celebration and simultaneous destruction. And I think it's a bad habit in the English press.
Are you happy to be just back to where you're from now?
That is lovely, and really has been incredibly just moving. Everyone used to live like this in a village and not leave. When I sometimes say to people, I live on the street I was born on, they literally look at me like horror. But that was the life of everybody for thousands of years. And it's not a bad life. You walk down the street, people who babysat you, generations of friends and mothers, families that you might not even know personally, but you know the face. You've seen that face for 40 years in different varietals. My kids go to school with the kids of kids I went to school with. It's nice.
Zadie Smith, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
That was Sarah Lyall and Zadie Smith in conversation about the new novel, The Fraud. And before that, my discussion with our reporters, Alexandra Alter and Julia Jacobs, about the National Book Awards and its hosting kerfuffle. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.